I bought it back, in silence.
You what? How could you?
You sold our home.
We had no choice.
The house had stood at the edge of the old road longer than anyone in my family cared to admit. Its wooden beams had weathered decades of storms. Its porch sagged slightly with age, and its windows reflected the quiet fields stretching beyond the property line. To most people, it was just another aging farmhouse surrounded by acres of land that had slowly lost its shine. But to me, it had always been something else. It was the only thing my grandfather ever truly loved. The land had been his pride, the house his refuge. Every nail in its walls had a story. Every mark in the floorboards carried the weight of time. As a child, I had spent countless afternoons wandering through the orchard behind the house, while my grandfather worked slowly in the garden, his hands deep in the soil as if he were speaking a language only the earth understood. He used to say that land remembered who cared for it back then. I didn't understand what he meant. Years later, I would when my grandfather passed away. The house was supposed to come to me, not because I asked for it. It was simply written that way in the will he left behind. A quiet decision he had made years before his health began to fail. The land, the house, and everything attached to it would belong to me. At the time, the decision created tension in the family that no one openly discussed. My father tried to pretend it didn't matter, while my mother avoided the subject entirely. My older brother laughed it off in public, but carried a bitterness that showed in small, sharp comments whenever the topic surfaced still. No one directly challenged the will, not then. The funeral came and went, like a blur of gray skies, and whispered condolences. People shook hands, shared stories, and slowly returned to their lives. For a few weeks, the house remained untouched, frozen in the silence left behind by my grandfather's absence. Then, without warning, everything changed. The shift was subtle. My parents began visiting the property more frequently, always with vague explanations about paperwork or maintenance. My brother started asking casual questions about taxes and upkeep costs, things I hadn't even begun to think about yet. They spoke about responsibility, they spoke about practicality, and eventually, they spoke about money. I didn't realize it at the time, but the family had already been drowning in debt long before my grandfather died. Credit cards, failed business ventures, loans quietly taken out and quietly ignored. Years of financial mistakes had piled up, like invisible walls closing in around them. The inheritance wasn't just land to them, it was a solution, a way out. The conversations became more pointed after that. My parents began suggesting that keeping the property would be too expensive for someone my age. They talked about maintenance, wind taxes, repairs that might be needed soon. They said selling it would be the smart choice. They said the money could help everyone. They said a lot of things that sounded reasonable if someone didn't look too closely. But something about the way they pushed the idea never felt right. The pressure grew slowly, disguised as concern. Every visit home seemed to include another reminder about how difficult it would be to manage the house. Every phone call included another subtle warning about financial responsibility. It became clear that they weren't just offering advice, they were steering the outcome. Then, one afternoon, the news arrived in the most casual way imaginable. The property had already been sold. The explanation was delivered like a minor detail. A simple update about paperwork that had supposedly needed to be handled quickly. My father spoke about legal complications, about timing, about how the buyers had made an offer too good to ignore, he said. The money had already been used to settle urgent debts. He said it was the only practical decision. The words landed with the quiet weight of something irreversible. by the time I fully understood what had happened. The house was no longer ours. No family meeting had ever taken place. No real discussion had happened. The inheritance that had been promised to me had vanished in a matter of weeks, resolved into a pile of financial obligations I'd never even known existed. The explanation was always the same. It was necessary, it was unavoidable, and, most importantly, it was already done. The family moved on quickly after that. The debts disappeared. My parents stopped mentioning money problems. My brother began talking about future plans again. The crisis had been solved. The cost, apparently, had been mine. For a while, I tried to accept it the way they did. I told myself that family mattered more than property. I tried to believe that my grandfather would have understood the decision, but the feeling never fully settled. Something about the situation refused to sit quietly in my mind. Small details didn't add up. The timeline felt rushed. The explanations always seemed slightly different each time the story was repeated. It felt less like a difficult decision and more like something that had been planned long before I knew what was happening. Then life moved forward the way it always does, pulling everyone in different directions. I left town and slowly created distance between myself and the memories of that house. My family assumed the story was finished, vanished from my life the same way it had vanished from theirs. But time has a way of uncovering quiet truths, and one evening, years later, while reviewing public property records for an entirely unrelated project, I saw something that made my hands stop moving across the keyboard. Familiar address appeared on the screen. The old farmhouse. The buyer listed. In the documents wasn't a stranger. It was someone connected to my family. Just weeks after it had supposedly been sold. Someone who had held on to it ever since. And in that moment, the story I had been told for years began to unravel, because the house had never really left the family at all. It had simply been taken from me, and suddenly, for the first time in years, I realized something that made the silence around the truth feel very different. The house could still be bought, and this time, no one in my family would see it coming. The discovery didn't arrive like a dramatic explosion of truth. It came quietly, almost casually, hidden inside a database of public records that most people would scroll past without a second thought. But once the address appeared on the screen, the past began unfolding piece by piece. The old farmhouse was still standing exactly where it had always been, at the edge of the road where the fields stretched out toward the horizon, according to the records. The property had changed hands only once since the day my father claimed. It had been sold to strangers, and the buyer wasn't a stranger at all. The name attached to the purchase belonged to a man who had been around my family for years, someone who had attended holidays and casually sat in our living room while pretending to be nothing more than an acquaintance, a distant cousin on my mother's side, a man who had never once shown interest in land, farming, or property investments, yet somehow, just weeks after the inheritance had supposedly been sold, he had purchased the entire estate. The timing was too precise to be coincidence. At first, I stared at the screen for a long time, trying to convince myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe the property had been sold again after the first buyer backed out. Maybe the records were incomplete. Maybe something simple had been misunderstood. The clearer the truth became, would never be in a public listing. The entire transaction, it had been arranged privately, and the price listed on the documents was far lower than the land had actually been worth. The more I looked at the numbers, the more obvious the situation became. My family had not sold the property because they had no other choice. They had arranged for someone they trusted to hold it, someone who would keep the land safe while they quietly erased my name from the inheritance. The truth had been sitting in plain sight, inside a courthouse database, and no one had expected me to look. The realization didn't bring the anger I thought it would. Instead, it created something colder and far more dangerous. Clarity. Suddenly, the strange conversations from years earlier began to make sense. The pressure, the rushed paperwork, the way the sale had been explained after everything was already finished. It had never been about urgency. It had been about control. My family hadn't wanted the house to leave their reach, which didn't want it belonging to me, for several days. I said nothing to anyone. I kept working, living my normal routine, and letting the information settle quietly in the back of my mind. The truth didn't need immediate confrontation. It needed patience. If the property had been hidden within the family all these years, there was only one reason to do it that way. They believed one day it would return to them. Eventually, the debts would disappear. Time would pass, and the land could be transferred again without anyone questioning the story in their minds. The situation had already been resolved. The inheritance had simply been redirected. But the records showed something they probably hadn't expected. The cousin who purchased the property had recently listed it for sale. The posting was new, only a few weeks old, buried among dozens of other rural listings across the county for the first time in years. The farmhouse was back on the open market, which meant the carefully hidden arrangement had just developed a crack. I studied the listing closely. The photographs showed the same front porch I remembered, though the paint had faded even more over the years. The orchard behind the house looked smaller now, but the trees were still standing in uneven rows across the land. The fields remained untouched. Time had moved on, but the place itself had barely changed. It felt strange looking at the images through a computer screen, like watching pieces of childhood through a distant window. The price listed for the property was higher than the amount recorded in the original purchase, but it was still well below the land's real value. The cousin wasn't trying to profit, he was trying to unload it, which meant something had changed inside the family. Maybe the arrangement had finally become inconvenient. Maybe someone needed money again. Or maybe the man who had quietly held the property for years was no longer interested in protecting someone else's secret. Whatever the reason, the opportunity was real. The house could be bought, and no one had connected the listing to me. Over the next several weeks, I began preparing for something my family would never expect. I didn't contact the seller directly. Instead, I created distance. A small investment company was registered under a neutral name. Lawyers handled the paperwork, agents made the inquiries, and every step of the process was designed to keep my identity hidden. The offer was submitted through layers of people who had never heard my name. From the outside, it looked like a routine real estate transaction, just another investor interested in rural land. Quickly. The seller accepted the offer with almost no negotiation. That decision confirmed what I had already suspected. He wanted the property gone. As the closing process moved forward, I continued researching the past transaction that had taken the inheritance away from me. Each document revealed a little more about how carefully the plan had been arranged. The signatures, the dates, the legal language. Everything had been executed with just enough legitimacy to avoid obvious questions. But the more I looked, the clearer one fact became. My grandfather's will had never actually been challenged. It had simply been ignored. The property had been transferred using legal loopholes and technical authority. My parents held during the estate process. They hadn't fought the will. They had worked around it for years. The truth had remained buried beneath layers of paperwork would expected me to examine. Now those same records were about to undo everything. The closing date arrived on a quiet morning several months later, in a small office building across town. Documents were signed, funds were transferred, and ownership of the property changed hands once again. The process was quick, efficient, completely routine when it was finished. The farmhouse officially belonged to the investment company, and the investment company belonged to me. The entire plan had worked perfectly. No phone calls from family, no suspicious questions, no warnings taught to them. The property had simply been sold to another anonymous buyer. The house they thought they had quietly kept within their reach for years was now back in my hands. Time since my grandfather died. The land he loved had returned to the person he had originally chosen. But reclaiming the property was only the first step, because the deeper I investigated the past, the more I realized my family had hidden something far more valuable than land inside that house. And if the records were correct, the truth waiting inside those walls was about to change everything. The first time I returned to the farmhouse after buying it back, the road felt longer than I remembered. Years had passed since I last drove past the rusted mailbox at the edge of the property. The gravel road leading to the house looked narrower now, partially swallowed by grass that had slowly crept inward over time. The trees lining the driveway had grown taller, their branches stretching across the sky like silent witnesses to everything that had happened in my absence. For a moment, the past felt close enough to touch. The house stood exactly where it always had, slightly weathered, but stubbornly unchanged. Its faded wooden siding carried the marks of countless seasons, and the porch still leaned a little to the left the way it always had. Even the cracked stone steps leading to the front door looked the same. Time had moved forward everywhere else but here. It had paused, standing in front of the house again, stirred memories that had been buried beneath years of distance. The quiet afternoons spent in the orchard, the smell of soil after my grandfather watered the garden, the way the wind used to pass through the fields and make the old wooden beams creak softly at night back then. The house had felt safe. Now it felt like a locked box, one that had been waiting years to be opened. The front door gave way with a stiff groan when I pushed it inward. Dust drifted through the air, catching the sunlight pouring through the windows. The inside of the house looked emptier than I remembered, but the structure itself remained solid. Most of the furniture had been removed at some point, likely by the cousin who held the property all these years. The rooms were bare, the walls stripped of the small decorations that once filled them with life, but beneath the emptiness, the house still carried its quiet weight of history. I walked slowly through the hallway, letting the silence settle around me. Every room held fragments of memory, faint reminders of a life that once existed here before everything fell apart. The kitchen still had the same old cabinets my grandfather installed decades ago. The living room windows still faced the fields where he used to sit every evening, watching the sunset as if the land itself was speaking to him. And then there was his study. The small room near the back of the house had always been his private space. As a child, I rarely entered it unless he invited me. It had been filled with shelves of old books, stacks of papers, and a heavy wooden desk that seemed permanently buried under documents. Most of it was gone now, but the desk remained, The surface was empty, its drawers closed tightly as if they had been waiting years for someone to open them again. For a moment, I simply stood there staring at it. My grandfather had always been careful with paperwork. Every receipt. He believed that records mattered. He believed the truth eventually lived inside them, slowly. I pulled open the first drawer. Inside were scattered papers left behind when the house had been emptied years earlier. Old bank statements, insurance forms, faded envelopes with addresses written in handwriting I recognized instantly, but none of it explained what my family had hidden. The second drawer held more of the same documents from years ago, most of them outdated and meaningless now. Then I opened the final drawer. At first, it looked empty, but when I reached inside and ran my hand along the back panel, my fingers brushed against something that didn't belong there, a seam. The wood shifted slightly under pressure, revealing a hidden compartment built into the back of the drawer. The small panel slid loose with a quiet click. Inside was a sealed envelope. The paper had yellowed, slightly with age, but the handwriting across the front was unmistakable, my grandfather's. For several seconds, I simply stared at it. The envelope had been carefully tucked away where no one would casually find it. Whoever cleared out the house after it was taken and me had completely missed the hidden space, which meant whatever was inside, untouched all these years. Seal broke with a soft tear. Inside the envelope were several folded documents and a handwritten letter. The letter was written in the slow, careful script my grandfather always used when something mattered. Each word felt deliberate. Each sentence carried weight. The message wasn't long, but its meaning became clear almost immediately. My grandfather had known exactly what might happen after he died. He had understood the financial trouble my family was in long before anyone else talked about it openly. He knew the temptation his land represented, and he suspected that the inheritance might not be respected the way he intended. So he had prepared something in advance. The documents inside the envelope weren't ordinary paperwork. They were legal records tied to the property itself. Evidence. Proof that the land contained something far more valuable than the house or the fields surrounding it. A private survey had been conducted across the farmland. The results were included in the documents, along with contracts and preliminary agreements involving a natural resource company. Survey had discovered significant mineral deposits beneath the property, deposits valuable enough to attract interest from investors and developers. My grandfather had never told the rest of the family about it. He had only shared the information with the lawyers who helped draft his will, and according to the paperwork in front of me, the land had been quietly scheduled for a future lease agreement that could generate substantial royalties for whoever owned it. The timing explained everything. The property had remained in my hands as intended. The opportunity would have eventually been presented to me instead. My family had rushed to sell the inheritance without ever knowing what was hidden beneath it. Thought the land was just farmland. Thought the house was just an old building with sentimental value. They had traded it away to cover their debts, without realizing they were sitting on something far greater. For years, the truth had been buried beneath the same ground my grandfather spent his life protecting. Now the documents were sitting in my hands, and the lease offer mentioned in the paperwork had a scheduled review date that was approaching, which meant the companies that once showed interest in the property might still be watching it, might still be waiting for the right moment to return. As I sat alone in the silent study, surrounded by the echoes of everything my family had done to take this place away from me, One realization settled firmly into place. They had betrayed me for a piece of land they thought was ordinary. But if the documents were correct, that land was about to become worth more than they had ever imagined. And when the truth finally came to the surface, they would realize exactly what they had stolen and exactly who now owned it. For years, my family believed the story had ended the day they sold the house. They believed the inheritance had been quietly erased, buried under paperwork and excuses no one would ever question. Time had passed, debts had disappeared, and the past had settled into the comfortable silence of something everyone preferred not to revisit. But truth has a strange way of resurfacing when people least expect it. The discovery, hidden inside my grandfather's desk, changed everything. For several weeks after finding the documents, I focused on verifying every detail they contained. The survey reports, the preliminary agreements, the legal notes written in careful handwriting across the margins of the pages. Nothing about them looked speculative or exaggerated. My grandfather had done his research thoroughly. The land beneath the farmhouse wasn't just farmland, it was valuable ground. The mineral deposits referenced in the survey reports had been identified years earlier. Company that specialized in evaluating rural properties. At the time, the discovery hadn't been widely announced because the company was still gathering investment partners. But according to the documents, the initial findings were strong enough that they had approached my grandfather privately. He had never signed the final lease agreement. Instead, he had chosen to wait. He believed the land would become more valuable with time, and he wanted the person who inherited it the final decision when the moment was right. Me. The review date mentioned in the paperwork was approaching, which meant the company that originally conducted the survey might still have an interest in the property, specializing in land rights and resource contracts. The documents were reviewed carefully, each detail compared against existing property records and corporate filings. Within a week, the lawyers confirmed what I had already suspected. The mineral rights associated with the land had never been transferred. When my family sold the property years earlier, had overlooked them completely when the inheritance was redirected, and the farmland quietly passed into my cousin's name. The legal paperwork only covered the surface property itself. Everything beneath the ground remained tied to the original estate documents, which meant those rights had followed the property right back to me. The value involved wasn't small, according to the updated geological estimates. The deposits beneath the farmland had grown significantly, more valuable over the years due to changes in demand and extraction technology. What my family had once dismissed as ordinary land was now considered a highly desirable resource site, and I owned all of with the exploration company that conducted the original survey still existed, though it had grown into a much larger operation over the past decade. When my lawyers contacted them regarding the documents, the response was immediate. Moved quickly after that. Engineers revisited the property, conducting updated assessments beneath the same soil my grandfather had spent decades caring for. The new reports confirmed what the original survey had suggested years earlier. The deposits were real, and they were valuable, enough to generate royalties that could last for decades. When the final agreement was signed, the contract secured a long-term lease that guaranteed substantial payments for the landowner. For the first time since my grandfather's death, the inheritance he intended for me had fully returned. The most interesting part of the situation had nothing to do with the money. Development spreads quickly in small communities. The arrival of survey vehicles and engineers on the property didn't go unnoticed. Within a matter of days, Rumors began circulating about the land at the end of the old road. People started asking questions, and eventually, those questions reached my family. At first, they assumed the activity had something to do with the new buyer who purchased the property earlier that year. They had no reason to think otherwise until the public filings were released. The lease agreement, like all resource contracts of that scale, became part of the official record, and the name attached to the landowner section of the documents wasn't hidden behind an investment company anymore. It was mine. The reaction from my family came quickly. Phone calls arrived. Within hours of the news spreading through the county records office, messages filled my inbox, each one carrying the same mixture of shock and confusion. They didn't understand how I had acquired the property. They didn't understand how the land, they thought, had been quietly handled years ago, had somehow returned to me. They had finally realized what they had given away. The inheritance they rushed to sell in order to erase their debts had turned into something far greater than they ever imagined, and now it belonged entirely to the person they had tried to cut out of the story for a long time. I didn't respond to the messages. There wasn't much left to say. The truth had already spoken for itself. Eventually, I returned to the farmhouse one evening, just as the sun was setting across the fields. The land looked almost identical to the way it had when I was a child. The same quiet horizon stretching beyond the orchard. The house still stood where my grandfather left it, watching over the ground he believed deserved patience and care. Standing there, I finally understood something he used to say. When we worked in the garden together, land remembers who protects it. My family had seen the inheritance as a financial problem to solve. My grandfather had seen it as something worth preserving, and in the end, patience had won. They had betrayed me for land they believed was ordinary. They had rushed to sell it without ever asking what it might become, and years later, the truth buried beneath that soil had returned everything they tried to take away. The farmhouse, the land, and the future my grandfather had planned were finally back where they were meant to be, not because of revenge, not because of luck, but because the truth as a way of surviving longer than the lies people build around it. And sometimes, the quietest victories are the ones no one sees coming.